Welcome to our well-played Spiritfarer, Age, Death, Peace, and a Pandemic. Little thing that happened. And so thanks for being here, and we're super excited to talk to you about our thoughts on this game, and hopefully have lots of time also to hear your thoughts about this game. And we've left a bunch of time for Q&A at the end. So we wanted to make sure that we put that out there right at the beginning. So do be thinking about what you'd like to discuss with us as we go through this. So first off, hi, I'm Andy Phelps. I'm a professor at American University and also at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, which is where I am right now. So that's a bit odd. Joining me is Mia Consalvo, who's the Canada Research Chair for Game Studies and Design at Concordia, and two of my students, Drew Mosier and Jocelyn Wagner, both at American University Game Center. And together, we have put together this well-played about a game called Spiritfarer, which is a cozy management game about death. So Drew, why don't you take us through a little bit of what the game actually is and how it's played before we get into what we think it might mean.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great way to start this. So in Spiritfarer, you play as a character named Stella, and she has just become the new Spiritfarer for this world, which is a take on the Greek mythology character of Charon, who is the ferryman of the dead. Takes people from the world of the living to the dead over the river Styx. So in this version, you have this great sea that you play through, and you as Stella traverse the sea and pick up new spirits on islands. There's Stella and Daffodil, your trusty companion of a cat. So yeah, you sail around this world looking for spirits to bring aboard your ship, and you interact with them and sort of complete these narratives with them and get to know them while bringing them aboard. So you complete tasks for them, feed them, and actually build homes for them aboard your ship, which we'll have an image of in a little bit. So yeah, you have a lot of different interactions with them. You play music with them, and you grow food for them and collect items that you can use to enhance your experience while playing this game with them. So the tasks that they have you complete for them vary a lot. It can be things like their last wishes, since they are all dead, right? Or it can be them helping them live out their fantasies from their life, right? There's a character who we'll talk about later, and she loved novels, right? So helping her sort of complete those fantasies from all of her novels she would read. And this is an image of the building of the boat itself, so you can see that it's modular, and you can add different homes. Every character has their house that they live in, and you sort of tailor it to them to sort of make this experience comfy for them, cozy, right? And then after you've completed whatever you need to do for all of these spirits, their needs vary. You then take them to what's called the Everdoor, which is a portal, a gateway to the afterlife, and you have your really sad goodbye with them, and they move on to the afterlife. And you do all of this navigating and traversing of the world through this map, which you can see. So you select your destination. There's lots of islands and different things throughout the world that you go and visit to either pick up new spirits, find resources that you use for crafting and building of your ship, and also just to complete the various tasks that these spirits have for you. So that's the interface that you use, and you also use that to take them to the Everdoor to say goodbye to them. So that's I think a pretty general overview of it. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think it's a resource management game. Pretty much each of the characters has a bunch of little quests that you do for them to advance their story to the point where they're ready to move through the Everdoor and into the afterlife. And that's kind of more or less the arc of the game, although we'll get into some variances on that in a little bit. So why is this unique?
So I think anyone who has played the game can agree that the narrative is one of the strongest things about this game, and the fact that it's beautiful visually. But it's a game that focuses on death, which is not uncommon with video games. We're used to seeing a lot of death happen in video games, but the way that it treats death is unique. Spoiler alert, if you haven't read the art book, this whole thing is kind of a metaphor for Stella's role as an end-of-care nurse, and this is supposed to be happening as she lives out her final moments and is kind of revisiting all these people that she's helped cross over. So the way in which you help these spirits is not what you would traditionally think of, I think. One of the first surprises to me about the game was that you aren't necessarily helping the spirits find closure in a more traditional sense. Like, for example, one of the first characters you meet, Gwen, you don't repair her relationship with her father and her family before she passes on. She instead comes to accept that that relationship is always going to be broken. And all of the characters have this sort of same acceptance of their life and their circumstances before they move on, rather than fixing those problems that they encounter. The game also deals with death and dying and illness in a really refreshing way. It's not seen as something that's necessarily bad or even scary, although they do talk about, being scared about death. But it's seen more as like part of life and something that, can be sad and can be scary, but can also be dealt with. It's not a grim game, even though it focuses on death. And one of the things that we think makes the game unique is the game's focus on older adults in particular. And I think we're saying older adults is over the age of 65 or over the age of retirement in the United States. But usually games, media, the society that we live in the US and Canada, if you're from there, doesn't typically treat older people as characters with agency or dignity. So I think Mia was going to talk a little bit more about that.
And I apologize. I don't mean to look like I'm in a witness protection program. It's been cloudy here all day, and just now the sun came out in the window that's next to me. So I apologize for the dramatic lighting that has suddenly appeared. So yeah, as Jocelyn was saying, and another thing that makes this game unique is so many older adults are featured in the game. And I mean, that's something we don't see in games, and they're presented in complex, interesting ways, and in ways that we don't see largely in the media and in the world around us. These are just some headlines, that you may have noticed recently. I think most of these are about the US. They could all apply to Canada as well. I mean, COVID shone a light on and really highlighted the problem, but it was there for decades before this, right? But for example, we saw with the rise of the pandemic how nursing homes were often left unprotected when we were focusing on hospitals. And even when suddenly attention was turned to them, there were shortages of protective equipment. In Canada, we had horrific stories of staff shortages and people laying in beds without food or water, or being taken to the bathroom for days. People in care facilities, the government, or the directives were not to take them to the hospital if they got sick. They were just largely seen as expendable, right? These are just the old, and we don't really care if they die. And it wasn't obviously just the pandemic, but this was just the heightened sense of it. And this has been going on for a long time. The idea that in capitalist societies, you lose your value once you stop working and contributing to society. You are less of a person, you have less value. You even saw this in early discussions of, should we lock down to save the old people, right? Because they were the ones who were more likely to die versus, young people who were less likely to get seriously ill. And so this is something that the game itself, I mean, it does not address COVID, but it really tried to re-envision old age, older people as having intrinsic value and worth themselves. Next slide. And just to give you a sense, we didn't do a full review of other games, but like as I was saying, Spiritfarer is one of the few that actually treats older adults in interesting and dignified ways. If you look just at some of the examples in past video games, we were joking about this just before, like one of the good examples of an older person in a game is Flemeth from Dragon Age, although at the end you discover she has some rather nefarious intentions for her daughter and what she intends to do with her. But we can all agree that she was written in an interesting and complex way. She wasn't just reduced to a simple stereotype. But some other members of the panel here will talk about a few of those other representations in other games and media.
Yeah, there are two other examples on here that I've found really interesting too. So Father from Fallout 4, and then Zachary Comstock from BioShock Infinite. Both of them are these sort of they're similar looking men, right? They're bearded older men. Both of them happen to be Fallout. It varies, but in general, they both happen to be the villains of these stories, right? And they're inflexible, sort of father knows best characters, right? And a lot of that is sort of implied that it's because they're these hardened older men that sort of as a result of their age have become sort of more evil, right? And in the case of Comstock from BioShock Infinite, his appearance as an old man is actually because of the evil things he's done and the sort of the moral corruption of his character as he's sort of progressed to reach the point where he is. So I thought those were two really interesting examples from media, and you can find that all, as we've said, you can find this a lot throughout, not just games, but all sorts of media.
Another example of poor, I think, representation is Carl from the game Detroit Become Human. He is not in the game for very long at all, and basically, when we talk about fridging or killing off a character in order to motivate another, usually cis straight white man's hero's journey or revenge plot, we usually are talking about women. But in this case, in the game, Carl is fridged so that Marcus the android can then go on to do his thing in the game. He's also disabled, and they really stereotype Carl as this kind of frail, helpless old man who is just here to dole out wisdom and then die for the cause so that a younger, more attractive, able-bodied man can go forward and like fight for civil rights. And then in the middle here up top, we have Madame Raz and the grandma from Celeste, who are both good examples of the crazy old lady stereotype. Madame Raz is, Madame Raz is not from a video game, but incoherent, kind of crazy, all over the place, but still like wise and sage. And the grandmother, the granny from Celeste, is kind of the same. She like laughs a lot at you and like gives out these small like tidbits of wisdom while mocking you for failing. So it's, they're pretty one note as far as characters go. And then for the ugly, had to pull in Dorian Gray as an English major, especially because it relates so much to Comstock, and that idea of like moral decay makes you look old and ugly.
Great. So, I mean, given all of that, I guess the question is sort of like, well, what did this game do so different? Why did it feel so different playing these characters in these games? And I think one of the things that we hit on is that to some extent, each of the different characters in the game that are older really sort of embody a different. And these overlap a little bit, but they embody sort of different societal fears about aging, about death, about dying, about grief, and they humanize it, right? They do this in a way where as you're getting to know these characters and their stories, you're you're coming to understand this notion of acceptance of planned loss, right? But also sort of this fitting very much with the idea of well played, right? This idea of a life lived, right, and the celebration of that life in the same moment, right? In that juxtaposition about what grief but reflection looks like. And so the next part of this talk, we're going to talk about some of the characters that did this for us in various ways.
Can I just jump in with one quick point?
Yeah.
Before we go to the specifics, which is that, as you can see here in the slide, these are some of the spirits. When you find any of the spirits in the world, they don't look like this. They sort of have a disguise on. Everybody looks the same. They're sort of wearing like a cloak and a mask. And then when they join you, they transform and you see these figures. And what's interesting is that they're all anthropomorphized animals. And so you don't actually see them as older, right? Like they don't necessarily read as having like wrinkles or being stooped or frail. And so I think one of the nice things about the game is that it sort of lets you see the personality of the individuals before, you necessarily know how old they are. And this is true even of like the younger characters as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There.
So Summer was one of my favorite characters. She's introduced pretty early on in the game, and she is a snake, if you can't tell. Her character design is very fun because her snake body kind of loops around to make one snake body arm and the other tail arm. It's very cute. She is a very spiritual character. She practices meditation. She uses healing crystals. She teaches Stella all about connecting to the earth and, taking the time to notice things around her. And it would be really easy for another game, to paint her as one note, kind of this like wise old sage, kind of like we were talking about in the examples of bad representation. But Summer's character, much like a lot of the other characters in Spiritfarer, is more complex than that. So you find out throughout the course of the game, and this is detailed more in the art book, but she had a long career as a successful businesswoman in the farming industry. She was like making a lot of money, and then she developed breast cancer due to the heavy chemicals that she was working with, which kind of ties into I would say Summer's villain, if you can call it that in the game, which is the dragons. And with the dragons, you go through this very literal process of pickaxing tumors off of the dragons in order to manage their pain. And it's very clear that Summer has a history with the dragon. Her father had a history with the dragon, which is cancer, which is also kind of like the game, that dragon cancer. It's a metaphor that's been used before. But she has these multiplicity of layers and thoughts and feelings and ideas. She went from kind of this businesswoman to finding love later in life and marrying Stella's aunt, #lesbian icon Summer. And then, kind of settling down and kind of eschewing the harmful farming practices that she had when she was younger and working in what I would argue is kind of an anti-capitalist stance, and turning more to spirituality and embracing the earth.
Right.
Anybody have anything to add?
No. Anybody else want to speak to Summer before we move on?
I think that was great.
Yep. All right. So the next one is Alice. So Alice is, you can see here, loves romance novels and crafting, and she introduces the orchard to the ship, so you can grow fruit and make all the recipes with fruit and all of that. And she reminisces a lot about her daughter and her late husband. And over the course of her time on the boat, she gradually slides ever more into dementia, and she can't distinguish at times whether she's speaking to Stella or to her daughter. And there's a point in the game where you actually essentially take some of her daughter's clothes and dress as her daughter in order to guide her to the spirit door, because she's not able to distinguish who is who, and who she can trust and who she can talk to, and all of that. And it's a really poignant thing. It illustrates what I think probably anybody that's had a loved one with Alzheimer's go through. It really does a fair and prolonged job of illustrating that sort of slide. But then it also there's a couple points in the game where it really grabs you and forces you to reflect on the way that people are treated in our society. And there's two that I'll mention. The first is when you first get Stella, when you first get Alice on your boat, you've had the boat for a little while, and you've built houses for other characters, and the size of the boat is constrained by how much resource you have. And at that point in the game, it's still fairly small, which means that you've mostly built things vertically, and so you start stacking the houses, and the houses are connected with these little ladders. And at one point in the game, Alice turns to you and says, could you please move my house to the bottom of the boat, because I can't climb the ladders so well. And you just feel like an awful human being. You're like, I am the worst person on earth that I didn't stop and think, right, that this person was going to have these issues. And I think that happened to all of us when we played the game. It's a really interesting piece of engineering in terms of the design. I went back, and it is possible to put her house on the floor right from the beginning if you already know this, but the chances of people doing it are pretty slim because of the way that it's orchestrated. And so that was the first one. And then the second one is the way the game operates is you have all these tasks to do during the day as you're traveling around during the daytime, and then at night there's sort of this forced, like, eventually you'll turn in, and you as Stella will go to bed and wake up the next morning with new things to do, and time will have progressed, and all of that. And so there's this sort of stopgap in you need to advance the action by either going to bed or what I would do sometimes is stay up all night and fish off the back of the boat, because I really liked the fishing thing. It's very tranquil. And there's this one moment where you wake up the next morning and you go outside, and Alice is sitting on the front of the boat, and she doesn't quite know exactly where she is. And she says, well, I've just been sitting here all night because you didn't check on me, right? And so there's this, again, you're sort of like, oh, wow, I don't feel good about myself because I've neglected this, this game character to the point where they've just sat outside and not really been cared for, right? And so there are these reflection points built into these characters where it really is commenting on how these people are being treated within our larger circle.
And I think related to that, one of the things we all noted was how the game doesn't do this just narratively, but it's procedurally built in, so you have to, like Andy was saying, like, you might have built her house on the bottom at the base, but chances are you didn't. And I'd be curious to what percentage of players actually, did this. And so you have to physically move it. And with Alice also, it becomes also one of the quests you do every day. You have to accompany her, walk her to the front of the boat and then walk her back home. And so it's through the doing, not just the telling of the game, that it's embodying what it means to, either be old and have dementia or to take care of someone, and think about their needs.
And I think the other thing is that moment you have with Alice where she's, left out because you have to walk her back to her room every night. I think you can't avoid it, because I think at one point you go to the Everdoor if you're progressed far enough in the story. And because there's not like time in the Everdoor, it always looks like daytime. You don't realize that it's nighttime. And when you come back from the Everdoor, it triggers her being out all night. And then that's something that, like, I keep wanting to call them moodlets. That's Sims. It's not. But they have like influences on their mood. And that's something that will like greatly decrease her mood, because she was left in the cold all night. She basically slept on the bow of the boat. But it's super interesting how that's built into the game, so you have to face that.
Mm-hmm.
Astrid?
Yeah, Astrid's an interesting character in that she's very much defined by her relationship with another spirit, which really makes her stand out. It's her unfaithful husband, Giovanni. So they basically, both of them were involved in various points of World War II. So Astrid, she hid Jewish children during the Holocaust, and her husband Giovanni, he was involved with like the resistance, right, to the Nazi occupation. So both of them go back to that, and they have a very long-standing relationship. But Giovanni is just perpetually unfaithful to Astrid, which really affects her character, right? In that the love of her life is just constantly betraying her. So, but at the same time, she's also this really strong-willed woman. So she has these very interesting sort of different pieces pulling on her character throughout your time interacting with her. So she's both selfless and selfish at times, which the art book also stresses. So she's very complicated and nuanced character, which makes her really interesting to sort of get to know and follow along. But we decided that she sort of interacts with this anxiety around aging and death, of loneliness and abandonment, right? In that, in the end, she finally decides to cut off Giovanni. She's had years and years of it, right? So it's just, she cuts him off, and they end up dying away from each other, even though they were lifelong partners. So her character explores that sort of that fear of abandonment and being alone when dying, but it doesn't refute that can happen, but it accepts it, but it's not so much of a, again, this isn't nihilistic, right? But it accepts that this can be a part of it, but that life can be brutal, but it can still be meaningful. So she has this long conversation with you when you're bringing her to the Everdoor about how she's seen a lot in her life, and she's seen a lot of bad things in the world, and that the world can be cruel, but that she has not regretted her time in it. And that she's upset by how Giovanni had treated her, and she's upset by how their relationship ended, but she doesn't have regrets.
Yeah, she's not defined by it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very nuanced, right?
One of the quests that the game gives you is Giovanni is on an island, and you're supposed to spy on him for Astrid to see if he's running around on her again. And you spy him with another woman, and then you go back to Astrid, and you're given the option to tell her the truth that you saw him with someone, or lie. I went for truth. Did you all go for truth, or did anybody lie?
Yeah, I went with truth.
I looked up what happens when you lie, because I think we had talked about this before, that we had all picked truth. Yeah. But yeah, I think we did all pick.
What happens if you lie? Does she find out anyway?
Yeah, so if you tell her the truth, she kind of gets mad at you, and she's like, well, why did you tell me that? Like, I didn't need to know that, even though she asked you in the first place. Mm-hmm. If you lie to her, I believe what happens is she kind of knows anyway, and she just like is a little depressed, and she's like, oh, I still think he is, Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a lose-lose either way.
Yep. But again, the game is drawing you in, to like, are you going to be complicit, or, give her the hard truth?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And last
is my favorite, Gustav. We each had a favorite. We were like, I want to talk about my favorite. So he's a bird, and I was just rewatching some gameplay video, and he's horrified, like if somebody would describe him as an art collector, but he does love art. Like his little home is sort of a Bauhaus artist studio. He's a musician. He plays the violin on the boat. He loves to travel. His reason for being on the boat at first is unclear. Like, you're not really sure what happened to him. And I didn't play the game when it was initially released, but there was a bit of a controversy around his character because the character had a neurodegenerative disorder and was supposedly, before he died, in a wheelchair. And Gustav had made a comment about, I think, like life was not worth living in the wheelchair. And several people called out the studio for being ableist, and they agreed and they removed the line. But it does like leave you with a little bit of a question as to like what exactly had led to his death. But he's still a very complex and endearing character, and through his time on the boat, he comes to believe that he doesn't need to be useful to society, to have meaning in life, that it's not just this capitalist idea, and that we have intrinsic worth, that we can be happy and fulfilled, without all those other accoutrements. And I will just say that I refused to let Gustav go to the Everdor for as long as I could because I didn't want to let him go. He also, when he's in a good mood, he makes sushi with his beak. He chops it up on the boat and gives it to you to distribute to other members, to other characters on the boat. But one of the other interesting things about the game as well is, there are no timers. Like, you don't have to get everybody off the boat, like in a specific time period. You can, it allows you to, go through your own process of being able to say goodbye to these characters, before you let them go. And it was only when I realized, that he had completed his quests, and that he seemed to be at peace. And it still took me a little extra time, but then finally I was at peace as well. And then I could let his story end. But the game lets you take that journey for yourself, which is another nice part of it. Does anyone have any other thoughts about Gustav?
Go ahead.
Sure. So one of the things that struck me about Gustav is that there are a couple of points where he sort of laments, like he used to be able to travel around and he had seen a bunch of the world, and he had visited all of these fancy places and so on, and he talks about sort of being trapped in not being able to do that anymore, not being able to get out and about and all that kind of stuff. And of course, I'm playing this literally locked in a basement in the midst of the COVID pandemic, right? And this is just like wave after wave of resonance of feeling like, like the world is closed off for me now, and recognizing that in fact that's a fear that a lot of people have around aging, right? Is no longer being able to travel widely, no longer being able to get out and see the rest of the world, and to feeling trapped and feeling shut in. The only other thing I'll say about Gustav is each of the characters has little bits of music and song that they use throughout the game. But if you're lucky, Gustav will come play violin on the middle of the ship, and it is to me, that was my favorite piece of music in the entire game. Like it just, like I just stopped everything else that I was doing in the game and just sat and listened to this bird play violin, because it's profound. So, Jocelyn, go ahead.
I was just gonna say off of Mia's point that the game really lets you take your time. One of the mechanics I appreciated most, and I noticed immediately, was after you go to the Everdor, you help the spirit pass on. They get their little constellation in the sky, and then it gives you a press a button to continue. So you can sit there as long as you need and cry, which I did quite a lot. But it doesn't rush you into going back into the game. And I think, that's very intentional to be like, this is a hard thing that you just did. It's okay to sit here and grieve until you're ready, and then you can press that button and go back. But take all the time you need. You don't have to pause it or like step away or anything. They build that in, and I thought that was great.
Yeah. And Andy, to return to your point about how you felt Gustav sort of embodied that one of those, as we've talked about, like one of those anxieties. I think that's what all these characters do well, is that they don't say that these anxieties aren't founded in nothing, right? They say that these are legitimate concerns that people have, and they've been informed by them, but they've been informed by their society on these concerns to have them. So they don't say that they don't exist, but they say like this is not the entirety of getting older, right? This isn't the only thing that's going to happen. It's not just dreadful, but it's still part of that process, which is what we think makes them so cool and like makes them stand out as great characters.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think we should. For this slide, we were supposed to talk about sort of those larger ideas behind like the lives and the deaths of these particular characters. And I think we've actually covered that pretty well. And I know this session only goes till 6:20, so I want to leave some time for questions and discussion with the audience. So I'm going to ask Andy to cut to the next slide. And these weren't obviously the only 4 spirits that you help. There are others as well, and there's other parts of the game that we wanted to mention briefly. I'll just bring in the case of Atul. He is your uncle. He's a frog, and he's one of the few characters you don't actually get to accompany. He doesn't tell you he wants to go to the Everdoor. He wants a big party, and you arrange everything, the food, invite people, and you go to this special place, and he has the party, and then the next day you wake up and he's gone. He's not people out where he is, and you're like, you think like as a player, you think I'm going to be on a fetch quest next to find Atul. You don't and there's a little flower on his door which signifies that he's passed on, and the game just suggests, and if you read accounts of it, he has moved on by himself. He didn't need your help. And in a way, I think this is also reflective of a lot of the challenges we've had with COVID and deaths, that sometimes you don't get to accompany people, right? Like you start to look forward in this game to the closure experiences, and you're denied that with Atul, which is also, another expectation or part of life. Sometimes you don't get to say goodbye, which I think is also really powerful. Yeah, no,
as we sort of all talked about, we all had our characters that we really got attached to. Atul was one that was my favorite. So yeah, that was really hard, and it was very intentional too. This disruption of the repetition that you had become accustomed to. There was some sort of comfort, as Mia said, in getting to say goodbye. It's still hard to say goodbye, but in the end, you get to do it, and it really rips Atul away from you, which is hard. And it stuck with me for a while. Like I had probably a week in the game where I just couldn't stop thinking about him because I felt cheated, which is how a lot of people feel, right? Especially in times of COVID, you feel cheated out of getting to say goodbye to your family.
Yep, absolutely. And then I'll just and we've gushed a lot about the game, but I will say in some of our analysis of the game, we're also critical of some of the points. I know that when we all played it, there are certain points within the game where it becomes very platformy, and you're in spots where you have to make a certain jump or this or that or the other, and we all sort of felt like, well, this doesn't have much to do with the actual story of the characters, and it wound up being sort of tasky and frustrating. There's a couple things that are timed, and you're like, why is this timed? This doesn't fit like the whole aesthetic of what's going on there. So. Which is all a way to say that while we've had some fun talking about it, and we look forward to your questions and comments, there is a bunch of work that went into the actual paper, and we hope that you will read it. It's going to be in a special issue of Well Played on the pandemic that I know Drew is working hard behind the scenes to get out from ETC Press. Not our Drew. Yeah. Other Drew Davidson is working to get out over at ETC, and so we look forward to your readership and your comments on that as it goes forward. But with that, we'll just move to Q&A. The rest of the slides are credits and references and contact info. And I will post the slides on my site afterwards if anyone wants them. But otherwise, I'd be delighted to take your questions or comments and go from there.
So I think there's like a Q&A function where you can ask a question.
Yeah.
Or you can just put it in chat either way.
Yeah. Or just put it in the
We'll
chat.
see it.
Yep.
We could pop up the contact slide as well.
If you want to get in touch with us.
Yes.
So, and
Or if you just want to tell us what your favorite character is,
Yeah, right, and why, or what you liked about the game, or maybe didn't like about the game. Because I just think it's a super interesting game right at this very particular moment in our discourse.
Obviously, we could talk about it for hours. Looks like we have a question.
No, we did not. We did. That's something we've talked about. We'd like to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, just with everything going on with the pandemic, it was just not a thing that we could organize. But that is something that we've talked about, trying to do some ethnographic player studies across different bits.
Yeah,
We did source a lot. Oh, sorry, Drew.
No, I think you and I were going to say the same thing.
Yeah, we did source a lot of player reviews online, from articles that people wrote to Steam reviews to Reddit, but difficult to tell the age and other demographic information of the people who did those. So specifically, older players playing the game we didn't get, but we did incorporate a section on player reactions in the paper.
Yeah. So Drew's asked a question, kind of related question. So he asked if we played it together as a group across time, and would you play it again? So we did not play it. We didn't play it together. We each played it individually, and I want to say so. Mia, I think, started it first, and I started it a couple weeks later, and then got it in front of Drew and Jocelyn, and so you played it kind of in parallel.
Yeah, we would talk.
We discorded a lot.
We'd like reach certain points where we're on the same pace, so we would stop and talk about it. And Jocelyn streamed it, so I would, while they were doing that, I would watch their stream if I was farther ahead, and we would talk about what was happening.
Yeah, I'd be like, "Oh my god, you need to see this! Like, have you done this yet?"
Right.
It was also interesting streaming it because one, I had to cry on camera, which was very fun. But also, people in the chat were talking about it who had also played it. And it was really cool to hear their experiences as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
You can actually play the game in tandem with another person. So if you do, like, one person controls Stella and one person controls Daffodil, but none of us, I don't think, tried that.
No.
And in terms of if we'd play it again, the studio is releasing new content for the game slowly. They're adding some new characters and some new locations. And so I was sort of waiting until a bunch of new stuff was in the game to play it again.
Yeah, I'm sort of waiting until there's like a bulk of it to go re-explore it, because there'll be a bunch of new stuff. Would I play it again standalone if it was just like without new content? Maybe in a little while. I got to be honest, it took me a while to, like, when I finished it and just put it down, I was like, I don't want to touch anything like that again for a little while. Like, I was pretty drained after playing the game, which is not a criticism of the game. It's just it really was sort of an emotional roller coaster, and you just sort of like, okay, I want something very, very mindless, and where I'm not thinking so deeply.
Yeah. Victoria had a question about, like, what about older people playing this game, and like, is that even a possibility? And I mean, I have a colleague at Concordia, Kim Sawchuk. She does a lot of studies of older people and media, and she does some work with games. And it is, if you're not in the space, it is surprising to learn. I mean, there are a lot of older adults who play games. And I've done some other studies of other games, and there are a lot of active players. If you think about it, many of them are retired. They have time, they have resources. It's usually a matter of finding them, you know, and telling them about the games, because they're not necessarily going to be on Steam, right? Or like typical gaming sites, although some of them are. So it's just a matter of, you know, like getting the word out to them. I've done workshops with older adults and told them about like some of these games, and they're like, these are fascinating, like where do you find them? You know, and so they're actually really interested in the content, and it's just getting, you know, it to them.
There was, I think they called her like the grandma gamer or something. She was this
old grandma hardcore.
Who would stream Halo, I think.
Yeah.
So definitely, like, there are older people out there playing games. I think it's not something that's the gaming industry thinks is really sexy, so we don't see it a lot. And also, they, like, if you look at the demographics of types of games people are playing, you know, they may not be playing the same types of games as younger folks. Not necessarily, obviously. This lady playing Halo is awesome, but it's not something you see a lot of, because you go on Reddit and there's like not a lot of older folks on there, so they are around.
There are a few questions about were there representations in the game that we didn't think were so great? Does anyone have a comment?
It's nuanced, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of the characters are relatively fleshed out, and so then the question becomes like, well, what about them is not great representation, right? I think it's just a hard question to answer, and part of that is because the nature of them being like anthropomorphic animals, you know, in terms of representation of like people of color, for instance, difficult to tell when they're all animals. In terms of like representation of LGBTQ plus folks, we have Summer, but I personally, as a notable gay, would have loved to see more. I do think the representation was, I don't want to say better than a lot of games. It was pretty good, I would say. But there were definitely some hits and misses, right? The whole thing with Gustav and the ableist content, you know, and that was the only, as far as we know, like physically disabled character in the game.
Right.
So it would be cool to maybe...
Yeah. And I think this would be a matter for like doing some audience studies, because, you know, like for me, some of the characters that I didn't think were that interesting or appealing to me, other people were like, that's my absolute favorite character. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like,
Yeah.
So it would really be interesting to talk to a wider diversity of players to pick out those nuances and see, like, what did they see in those characters? What did they take away? You know, was it something that really resonated with them? You know, and like if then there was any character that was kind of still left out, right, that didn't necessarily appeal.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it is. And I've looked online at a bunch of the player reviews and reactions and stuff like that. And I mean, the character seems to work for a lot of folks. For me, I couldn't get in. Stanley just kind of drove me a little nuts. The mushroom kid.
Stanley made me cry so much.
Yeah.
And you know, like I understand the narrative, right? Like I felt bad at the moments you're supposed to feel bad and that stuff, but just like as a character, it just didn't seem to have the depth to me that a lot of the other ones did.
And there were the brothers, remember?
See, I really loved Mickey and Bruce, and I know that's a controversial take.
Yeah. So you like them?
I loved them.
See?
Yeah.
again, like,
Controversial.
Yep.
but we are, I think, out of time.
Oh man, that went by fast.
It did.
Yeah.
Andy, would you like to close?
But my only close is just feel free to reach out and contact us and give us your additional thoughts and all that kind of stuff. And also do read the paper when it comes out. And
play the game if you haven't.
And play the game if you haven't, right? Or if you have played the game, there is new DLC coming and that stuff. And so
Thank you for coming.
And thanks for coming and listening to us.